Hey everyone, this is just a reminder that this video is the second part of a two-part series. If you haven't seen the first part already, I highly recommend going back and watching that because it provides a lot of the context for this video. If you have seen it already, thanks for watching.
And now, our feature presentation.
Last time that we talked about the Hunchback of Notre Dame, we discussed the differences between the movie and the book, particularly regarding its characters and themes. In this second part, I wanted to pivot and touch on some of the film's artistic accomplishments, as well as some of the unique challenges that it had to face. In order to do that, I need to explain one unique way that traditionally animated films differ from live action, particularly regarding their runtime. To start, there are technical limitations on animated features that live action simply doesn't have to deal with. Any animator will tell you that every second of animation that you see on the screen is a challenge to produce, and that nothing is as easy as it seems. Primarily, these unique technical complications come down to the process of how hand-drawn animation photography works. A process that can be relatively time-consuming and expensive compared to live action, at least on a frame-by-frame basis. In live action, you capture images in real time using film, either physically or digitally, and while this method certainly has its limitations and costs, it's still incredibly simple compared to the frame-by-frame process of hand-drawn 2D animation. Without the special effects, fancy set, prop design, or big-budget stars, live action can be relatively inexpensive to shoot, although this simplicity of production is increasingly rare in today's blockbuster landscape. However, in 2D animation, it's a little bit more complicated, especially before we had the advent of cheaper digital consumer animation tools. For instance, before actual photography of animated cells could even begin, every frame of an animated film had to be rendered as an individual drawing by an artist, and each of those frames had to be drawn in sequence, one image at a time, giving the illusion of movement. That's not even mentioning things like backgrounds or ink and paint. This frame-by-frame process is where the problems of runtime start to arise. Think about it. There are 24 frames for every second of screen time in a traditionally animated film. Then you have to multiply that number by a factor of 60 for every extra minute you add to a film. The result is a whopping total of around 1,440 extra drawings for every extra minute added to an animated film's runtime. As you can imagine, paying artists to create almost 1,500 drawings per minute of film isn't exactly cheap, regardless of how many artists are working on that individual sequence. That's why animation studios generally focus on making shorter, more condensed narratives than their live-action counterparts. Anything more freeform would simply be too expensive to attempt more than occasionally for an animation studio. It makes a lot of sense that an animated film's runtime would be budgeted just like everything else in a production, as any unexpected extra footage would exponentially inflate the cost of a film. That's part of why most traditionally animated features tended to stay within the 60 to 90 minute range, although there are certainly exceptions to that rule. This fact, coupled with the daunting task of condensing a massive 150,000-word narrative with a complex plot into a feature film, seemed to put some major restraints on what the Disney artists and writers could do with the narrative. I already mentioned some of the things that Disney did to the plot in the last video, but I only briefly touched on what this did to the film's pacing. The truth of the matter is that the pacing of this movie can be a bit jarring sometimes. It's an issue that I often see brought up in conjunction with this film. However, because of the reasons that I just listed, I may be willing to give the film a little extra slack with this than most critics would. Still, just because it doesn't bother me, doesn't mean that it won't bother someone else. The truth is that not all moments are given equal emotional weight in this film, and although it may not be the fault of the individual artists, it does still affect the finished product, and is often brought up by others as a common critique for this film. That being said, I personally think that this film's artistry and emotional weight more than make up for some uneven pacing. The film might not always stick the landing with its timing and tone, but when it does, it really knocks it out of the park. These moments of true emotional weight are powerful, and in my opinion, they more than make up for any wobbliness found in the pacing of the rest of the film. Mileage may vary on this point, but I really don't think most audiences will notice. I honestly believe that most people will be so swept up in the artistry of it all that they won't care as much about minor issues. I think part of the film's ability to sweep viewers off to another time and place like this comes from how much research went into this film. Just like several other Disney Renaissance projects, the filmmakers and artists on The Hunchback of Notre Dame went through an extensive pre-production phase that focused on research and development. This included a trip to Paris, where they were given a private tour of the Notre Dame Cathedral by experts of the property. They also did a fair amount of stylistic and artistic research of the city so that they could do justice to the wonder of 14th century Paris on screen. They wanted to make sure that their renderings in the film, while heightened and stylized to fit the nature of animation, were still as aesthetically accurate as possible. This leads me to the design and animation of the film. Does The Hunchback of Notre Dame stand up to the high standards set by previous Disney films of the decade? I'm pleased to say that yes, for the most part, Hunchback is generally on par with the uncompromising quality of animation and visual spectacle that the Disney Renaissance became known for. The color palette is excellent, the mood is amazing, and the 2D backgrounds are rendered so beautifully with a level of detail that's sometimes staggering, especially when you realize that every time the camera cuts to a new angle or a new area of scenery is shown, an artist must paint a new background. And the fact that they're still at this level of quality deserves recognition. Sometimes the film uses 3D models to mitigate the labor involved in the backgrounds process, but it's honestly shocking how much of the scenery is still produced via highly detailed background paintings. As for the specifics of the animation itself, this film has some truly breathtaking sequences. The sequences that stand out the most to me are the scene from the musical number Out There, the astonishing effects animation that we see in Hellfire, and the gorgeous animation in the film's climactic tour de force sequence labeled Sanctuary. The first time I saw the latter sequence as an adult, I was absolutely stunned. It simply boggles my mind that James Baxter and his team were able to draw the two-dimensional Quasimodo in perfect perspective and synchronization against the three-dimensional background of the cathedral, all within complicated camera movements. Any artist will tell you that the technical skill needed to pull off an in-perspective sequence like this is insane. In that light, what they accomplished here is nothing short of astonishing. Even outside of the aforementioned sequence, the film features some truly gorgeous animation all throughout its runtime. And while the Disney Renaissance may not always be known for its unique stylization, which modern films have made us accustomed to, its near-perfect, so smooth you don't even notice it character animation is really on full display here. There's a reason why the Disney style dominated the industry for so long. The effects animation, such as the fire, shadows, and light, are equivalent to Disney's best, and sometimes these shots even steal the show. There's a level of expertise here that is on par with the greatest Disney films of all time. I feel like the magnitude of what the Disney Renaissance films accomplish with a more restrained style, at least in terms of the subtlety and heightened realism of the characters' performances, might get lost on most audiences today. Especially if one isn't aware of how difficult it is to pull off believable form and movement with a sequence of drawings. The only part of this film that can sometimes look a little strange is the computer-generated elements. For the most part, the shading and texturing of these assets is executed well enough that they're not too distracting. However, there are still a few scenes where the assets can look a bit clunky. This is especially noticeable in the close-up shots of the crowds. For this film, the computer animation department of Disney's feature animation studio decided to really experiment with CGI crowds to save money, labor, and headaches on what was once one of the most time-consuming, annoying, expensive, and labor-intensive elements of past animated features. The creation of a 3D crowd in a 2D animated movie was a major innovation for Disney, and for the most part, they pulled it off pretty well, especially when you consider how limited the technology was at the time. Through the use of clever cuts, sleight of hand with foreground elements, and extensive use of wide shots, the results are passable and even quite effective in certain scenes. But as soon as you give us a close-up shot of those computer-generated characters, the primitive nature of the technology becomes quickly apparent. This probably won't bother most viewers, and perhaps I only cared about it because of how much I study animation history. But I thought it was worth pointing out anyway, just in case there's anyone out there who's like me. If nothing else, I think it's fascinating to see how far we've come with simulated CG crowds. But now that we've covered the visuals, I want to pivot to what has probably become my favorite aspect of this film, and one of the most important elements of any good Disney feature in general: the film's sound. Victor Hugo's novels have a history with epic musicals and atmospheric historical dramas, at least sound-wise, and this film is no exception. In my opinion, the paramount reason for this is the film's iconic score. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. In my opinion, the film's soundtrack is one of the most jaw-dropping entries in Disney's entire animated catalog. There are simply no words to describe the emotions that wash over me when the music swells at the end of The Bells of Notre Dame, during the title card reveal, or during the transition between Heaven's Light and Hellfire. Not to mention the goosebumps that I always get during the climax of the song Out There, or during the emotional bombshell that is the film's final scene. There are so many musical motifs and instrumentals in this film that simply give me chills. The songs themselves are absolutely gorgeous, with well-written lyrics and powerful orchestration, taking everything that's being communicated through music in this film to the next level. Seriously, the soundtrack is unreal at times, with Tom Hulce's performance of Out There being an absolute showstopper, and in my opinion, one of the best hero ballads or I Want songs in Disney history. Heidi Mollenhauer's performance of God Help the Outcasts profoundly moved me, and although he may not always be the best singer, even Tony Jay's rendition of Hellfire is undeniably iconic and terrifying to behold due to the sheer power of its composition and lyrics. I won't get into the controversy surrounding this song because I went over a lot of those issues in the first video, but for right here I'll say that regardless of what you think about this song in context to the movie, there's no denying on its own it is a powerful piece of music and an absolute showstopper. This is the type of song that most Broadway musicals wish they had. Disney legend and 8-time Academy Award-winning composer Alan Menken is at his absolute best here with the music, and Broadway luminary and 3-time Academy Award winner Stephen Schwartz's lyrics are quite simply a phenomenal match. They fit perfectly with Menken's style and elevate this film's score to another plane of existence. It's so beautiful. And while I personally don't think that any Disney lyricist ever quite matched the same special Disney magic tone that the late great Howard Ashman created with Alan Menken, Schwartz is certainly the lyricist that seems to come the closest for me. I wish I could play examples of the songs so that you can hear what I'm talking about. But we all know how that works on YouTube, so you'll just have to trust me on this one and go listen to the soundtrack as soon as you possibly can. Believe me, it will absolutely be worth your time, and I honestly think that it's something really special. And that's not even mentioning the excellent sound design, always an overlooked feature in any Disney project, or the masterful vocal performances given by the main cast. The Academy Award-nominated Tom Hulce, Mozart himself, gives a brilliant vocal performance as the titular character. Filled with youthful optimism, he is both a sensitive soul and a courageous hero, who really pulls on your heartstrings in both instances, especially when he's singing. In this way, Hulce is able to honor the empathic legacy of other performers who have brought the character to life in the past. Demi Moore offers a fan-favorite performance as Esmeralda, delivering dialogue with smooth charisma and feisty inner strength. This really was perfect casting, and the sensitivity that Moore brings to the character is bold and iconic. Kevin Kline brings a theatrical, swashbuckling charm to Captain Phoebus, matching his love interest's fighting spirit. Through this charisma, Kline is able to balance both the comic and grim sensibilities of the character with admirable aplomb. The comic relief characters, while not necessarily a high point of the film for me, are admittedly portrayed quite expertly by some great vocal personalities and comedians. These include Mary Wicks, Charles Kimbrough, and Jason Alexander as the Gargoyles, with Jane Withers filling in wonderfully after Wicks' unfortunate passing during the film's production. There's also another fan-favorite portrayal in this film in the form of Clopin Truffaut, garnering a surprisingly loyal internet following for a single performance, and played incredibly entertainingly by stage veteran Paul Candle. There's even a sizable cameo performance by the late David Ogden Stiers, beloved the world over by Disney fans as the voice of Cogsworth and other memorable Disney characters. But in my opinion, the true vocal standout of the production was the absolutely amazing performance of the legendary Shakespearean actor and voiceover artist, Tony Jay, in the part of Claude Frollo. Disney had dabbled with him in Beauty and the Beast, having him play a side character in that film, and they were apparently so awestruck by his performance that they actively searched for opportunities to use him in future productions. In my opinion, Tony Jay was born to do voiceover. His voice is just so fascinating to listen to. In fact, I could listen to him narrate an entire audiobook if I was given the chance. But I'd go even further than that endorsement, and say that I think Jay was born specifically to play a Disney villain. His voice can carry so much menace, presence, and power that it feels like a theatrical match made in heaven. Every time I hear his performance as Frollo, I marvel at the narrative weight that it carries. He's terrifying in all the right ways, and I'm so glad Disney chose him for this project. In my opinion, it's one of the most enjoyable aspects of the entire film, and that's saying a lot considering how much artistry went into this production. However, despite all this artistry and effort, I'm sad to say that for some reason the Hunchback of Notre Dame seems to have fallen by the wayside compared to other features in the Disney Renaissance, at least to the Disney company itself. I think this is a shame because in many ways it's one of the most experimental works of that era, and it isn't afraid to try something new with its subject matter. Mainstream audiences, at least those outside the animation fandom or those that have major nostalgia for the Renaissance, will barely bring it up in conversation and are much more likely to point out Beauty and the Beast or The Lion King. And while I agree that those are some of the most famous Renaissance titles for a reason, I still find it a shame that The Hunchback of Notre Dame must be relatively forgotten as a result. It's like when you bring up movies like Mulan or Tarzan, and people go, "Oh yeah, I forgot those were part of the Renaissance. I love those." These films really do have large fan bases, but for some reason or other, they never seem to reach the same widespread fame or cultural endurance as the earlier Renaissance titles, at least in terms of merchandising and in-company representation. I'm not really sure why this is the case, especially considering the film's positive critical reception and box office success. Unless Disney somehow spent $250 million on marketing this $70 million film, which I highly doubt, then this film was easily able to make a profit at the box office. And it seems weird to me that Disney wouldn't want to lean into that financial success as much as possible. I have a few theories of the reason that maybe I'll make a video on one day, but I'm not entirely certain. And regardless of the reason, The Hunchback of Notre Dame deserves more attention from the company than it's been getting. While some may not consider The Hunchback of Notre Dame to be on par with the other Renaissance titles I mentioned earlier, I still don't think it deserves to be forgotten as much as it seems to have been by Disney. Maybe this is just my experience, and it actually receives more love than I think it does, but I still rarely see it in the Disney parks, on licensed merchandise, or in any of the company's more prominent videos or social media posts. And that kinda makes me sad, because I personally think that The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a film that's worthy of recognition, and a truly special entry in Disney's catalog of animated features. At the time that it was made, it pushed the boundaries of what a Disney film could be, in terms of innovation, artistry, and pure filmmaking ambition, and it's a prime example of why the studio's name was synonymous with animation in the mid-1990s. Regardless of any possible critiques that I've mentioned in these two video essays, it's nearly impossible to deny that they're simply nitpicks, mere drops in the pond of what they managed to accomplish here. The Disney artists poured true passion into every single frame of this film, and really redefined what an animated film could be in the first place, opening up the eyes of countless viewers to the possibilities of this amazing art form. In my opinion, this film is an absolute masterpiece from start to finish, and it's definitely worth seeing at least once as an adult, especially for animation fans. If nothing else, I hope that people can walk away from this set of videos feeling inspired by the men and women who worked so hard on their favorite films, and that we all gain a new appreciation for the artistry that made The Hunchback of Notre Dame so meaningful to so many people.